I have always loved being out in nature. Hiking had become my escape from everything else in life. The silence of the woods, the smell of pine needles, the crunch of dirt under my boots. It always made me feel free. But the trip I'm about to talk about was nothing like the usual peaceful hikes I used to take. It was the kind of experience that changes how you think about the outdoors. It showed me how fragile a person can be out there, how quickly things can turn dangerous, and how small you really are when you're alone in the wilderness. It was in late summer when I planned the trip. The weather was warm during the day but cooler at night, perfect for long treks. I picked a trail that wasn't too popular, one that stretched deep through a mountain range and circled back in a long loop. The whole hike would take 3 days if I stuck to my plan, and I wanted to do it solo. I had done plenty of hikes alone before, and the thought of having several days to myself in the wild felt refreshing. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, a water filter, extra clothes, first aid kit, and a map. My backpack felt heavy when I lifted it onto my shoulders, but that weight always felt like part of the deal. The first day went exactly as I hoped. The trail wound up through thick forest, with sunlight breaking through the trees in golden lines. I moved at a steady pace, taking breaks when I needed to. I saw a few deer early in the morning and a hawk circling overhead around midday. I didn't run into another hiker, which wasn't surprising considering the trail's reputation for being long and quiet. By late afternoon, I had found a good flat spot near a stream where I set up my tent. The sound of running water carried through the trees, and I boiled some noodles for dinner before crawling into my sleeping bag. The night was calm, and I fell asleep easily. The second day started just as smoothly. I packed up early, following the trail as it climbed higher into the mountains. The air was cooler, and the trees started to thin as I gained elevation. I stopped often to take in the views. The sky stretched wide and endless, and the slopes rolled out below me like a green sea. I remember thinking how far away everything looked, how disconnected from the rest of the world I felt. By late afternoon, I was deep into the loop, far from the nearest trailhead. That isolation was exactly what I wanted when I started, but soon it became clear that it also carried its own risks. The trail narrowed as I made my way along a steep ridge. The ground on my right side dropped off into a sharp slope, and on my left a wall of rock rose above me. The path was still manageable, but I had to pay attention to each step. My backpack shifted with my movements, and every time I felt the weight pull me sideways, I gripped my trekking pole a little tighter. I reminded myself not to rush. The sun was still high, and I had time to reach the lower valley before dark. Then, without much warning, things started to go wrong. It began with the weather. Clouds moved in faster than I expected. The bright blue sky dimmed as gray rolled across it, and soon the air grew heavy. The forecast I checked before leaving had called for clear skies, but mountain weather doesn't always follow predictions. By the time I started descending from the ridge, the wind had picked up. It rushed through the trees below and made a low, constant roar. I picked up my pace, hoping to reach the valley floor before any storm hit. As the wind howled, the trail became rougher. Roots stuck out, rocks shifted under my boots, and the slope down was steep. My legs were starting to ache from hours of walking, but I pushed on. I remember telling myself that once I reached the valley, I could set up camp and wait out whatever was coming. But the descent was longer than it looked on the map, and I began to realize I had underestimated how much ground I still had to cover. That's when I slipped. It happened quickly, but I can still picture it in slow detail. My boot caught on a root as I stepped down, and the weight of my pack pulled me off balance. I tried to steady myself with my pole, but it jabbed uselessly at the dirt, and then I was falling. I slid hard down the slope, rocks scraping against my legs, branches snapping under me. I landed twisted against a boulder with the wind knocked out of me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved as I sucked in air, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. When I finally managed to sit up, the first thing I felt was pain in my ankle. I tried to move my foot, and sharp heat shot up my leg. It wasn't broken, but it was badly twisted. I could tell from the swelling already starting to form under the fabric of my sock. My hands were scraped and bleeding, and my side throbbed where I had hit the rock. I I sat there in the dirt for several minutes, shaking, trying to gather my thoughts. The trail was somewhere above me, out of sight now. I had slid far enough down that I couldn't see it through the trees and brush. Climbing back up would have been difficult even without the injured ankle. With it, it felt impossible. I realized quickly that I had to figure out another way. I forced myself to check my backpack. The fall had knocked it halfway off, but most of my gear was still intact. My water bottles had held, my food bags were fine, and my tent poles hadn't snapped. The only thing that worried me was my map, which had gotten torn in the fall. The part showing the lower valley was smudged and unreadable. I knew the general direction I needed to head, but without clear markings, I was mostly relying on memory. I wrapped my ankle with an elastic bandage from the first aid kit, then tightened my boot as much as I could over it. Standing was painful, but I managed it by leaning on both trekking poles. I told myself I could still keep moving slowly. Staying in one place didn't feel safe. I was far off the trail now, and the chance of another hiker stumbling across me was slim. I needed to get lower, closer to water, and hopefully find the trail again somewhere ahead. The wind grew stronger, and soon the first drops of rain hit the leaves. I started moving downhill, forcing myself to step carefully even though every movement sent pain shooting up my leg. The forest was dense, and fallen branches littered the slope. The rain picked up, making the ground slick. I slipped several times, catching myself against trees, but each time I felt my ankle protest more. My progress was slow, painfully slow, and the light was fading fast. By the time the storm hit fully, I was desperate to find shelter. Rain poured in sheets, soaking through my jacket and running down my face. The thunder rolled across the mountains, each rumble shaking the ground. I spotted a cluster of large boulders at the base of a slope and pushed myself toward them. Between two of them was a narrow space just wide enough to crawl inside. It wasn't much, but it was better than being exposed. I dragged my pack under the rocks and sat shivering in the dark. Water dripped down the stone walls, and the wind still howled outside, but at least I was somewhat shielded. My ankle throbbed relentlessly, and I could feel it stiffening as the cold set in. I ate a protein bar with shaking hands and drank carefully from my bottle. Every sound outside felt amplified: the rush of water, the crack of branches in the wind. I barely slept that night, jerking awake every time thunder boomed. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, but the forest was dripping and silent. My ankle was worse, swollen and stiff. I forced myself to stretch it, biting down hard on my lip to keep from crying out. I had to keep moving. Staying by those rocks wasn't an option. I packed up slowly, moving with clumsy hands. The trail was still nowhere in sight, so I picked the direction that felt downhill, using both poles to support myself. Hours passed like that. Every step felt like a battle, and my body was wearing down. The cuts on my hands had scabbed but throbbed when I gripped the poles. My clothes were still damp, rubbing against my skin until it felt raw. Hunger gnawed at me, and though I had food, I rationed it carefully, not knowing how long I'd be out there. At one point, I heard movement through the trees and froze. My heart leapt, thinking maybe it was another hiker. But then I saw the dark shape of a bear moving between the trunks. It hadn't noticed me, but my body went cold. I crouched low, gripping the poles, barely breathing as I watched it pass. It was far enough away that I wasn't in immediate danger, but the sight made me painfully aware of how vulnerable I was. Out there, alone, injured, I was nothing compared to something that strong. The days blurred together after that. I kept moving, always downhill, sometimes finding streams to refill water, sometimes stumbling across old deer trails that helped me cut through the brush. My ankle never improved. It only swelled more and made each night harder to bear. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, broken by the cold or the rustle of animals nearby. Finally, on what I think was the fourth day since my fall, I reached a wide clearing. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly. A dirt road, faint and rough, but undeniably man-made. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I limped toward it, tears in my eyes. Roads meant people, and people meant safety. I followed that road for what felt like forever, each step burning through my ankle. I had been hiking alone for years, usually on marked trails, always carrying the usual gear: map, compass, first aid kit, food, and a light pack. I had done overnight trips before, but this time I wanted something harder, something that felt like a challenge. I picked a route I had never tried before. It wasn't officially closed, but most people didn't go there because the trail was narrow, steep, and barely maintained. That was exactly what drew me in. I wanted to feel the weight of real wilderness pressing in, the kind that stripped away comfort and left you with only your own decisions. I parked my car at a small pull-off on the side of the road, shouldered my pack, and set out. The sky was overcast, heavy with a gray ceiling that promised rain later in the day. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The first stretch of the trail was forgiving, winding gently through tall trees, their trunks dark from recent storms. The ground was soft, padded with a layer of needles that muffled my footsteps. I moved at a steady pace, taking in the silence, the only sound being the occasional drip of water falling from branches. After an hour, the trail grew narrower and steeper. The forest thickened around me, and the trees leaned close as if guarding the path. Roots snaked across the dirt, slick from moisture, and I had to watch my footing carefully. I carried trekking poles, and they helped keep me steady, but the climb forced me to slow down. I sweated under the weight of my pack and stopped once to drink from my water bottle. The air grew cooler the higher I climbed, and the forest floor became rocky, less forgiving, as moss-covered stones jutted out of the earth. Eventually, the path led me to a ridge. From there, I could see down into a valley, a dark carpet of trees rolling toward the horizon. The view was impressive, but what unsettled me was how far away it made everything seem. I couldn't see a road, a house, or even a break in the forest, just green stretching endlessly. That was the point of this hike, but the isolation struck me harder than I expected. I took a deep breath, adjusted my straps, and pushed on. The ridge trail was narrow, no more than a foot wide in some places. On one side was a wall of rock, and on the other a sheer drop that plunged into the treetops below. The dirt path was unstable, crumbling in spots, and I had to test each step before committing my weight. My legs felt stiff, and I moved with slow caution, every sense tuned to balance and survival. There were moments where the edge looked ready to give way, and I imagined what it would feel like to lose my footing, to slide helplessly down into the trees. I forced the thought away and focused on planting each step carefully. Hours passed. The trail wound deeper into the ridge, weaving up and down, sometimes dipping into shadows where the rock pressed overhead, sometimes opening to the wind that howled along the edge. I ate a snack when the trail widened enough to let me sit safely, chewing slowly, staring out at the endless green below. I kept track of the time, knowing I would need to find a place to camp before nightfall. My plan was simple: follow the ridge until it descended into the forest again, then camp near a stream marked on my map. But plans don't always hold. By late afternoon, the weather shifted. The overcast sky thickened into storm clouds. The air dropped colder, and the wind pushed harder across the ridge. I heard distant thunder echoing, dull and far off, but growing closer. I didn't want to be caught on this exposed trail during a storm. The ground was already slick, and rain would turn it into something dangerous. I sped up, my steps quicker but no less careful. My eyes searched for any spot wide enough to ride out the weather, but the ridge offered nothing, only stone walls and sheer drops. Then the rain started. At first just a mist, cold droplets peppering my jacket, but soon it thickened into a steady fall. The dirt under my boots softened, turning to mud. Each step became a fight to keep balance, poles planted firmly, legs stiff and cautious. The storm rolled overhead, dark clouds dragging across the sky, and thunder cracked so loud it rattled in my chest. I tightened my hood, bent low, and kept moving. The trail ahead bent sharply around a bulging section of rock. As I rounded it, my boot slipped. My leg shot out, and I slammed my pole down just in time to stop myself from sliding off the edge. My heart pounded, the image of falling flashing in my mind with brutal clarity. I pulled myself back, breathing hard, my body trembling from the adrenaline. The ground here was a slick sheet of mud sliding toward the drop. It felt unstable, as if the trail could break loose entirely. I knew I had to get off the ridge. Pushing forward was too dangerous, and going back meant facing the same unstable sections I had already crossed. I scanned the wall of rock to my left. About 20 feet ahead, I spotted what looked like a faint scramble up, where tree roots clung to cracks in the stone. It wasn't a marked trail, but it was my only chance. I edged toward it, moving slow, and when I reached it, I stowed one pole, used my free hand to grab the roots, and began climbing. The climb was exhausting. Mud smeared my gloves, and the rock was slick, but the roots held. I pulled myself up, scraping knees and shins, until I reached a small ledge just wide enough to crouch. From there, I could see a slope leading up into thicker forest above the ridge. It was steep and tangled with brush, but it was safer than the exposed edge. I clawed my way up the slope, dragging myself through wet branches, mud soaking my pants, rain hammering down. By the time I reached the cover of trees, I was breathing hard, my arms burning, but relief washed through me. I was off the ridge. I checked my map. I had strayed far from the marked trail. The slope I had climbed wasn't on the route, and now I was in dense forest with no clear path forward. The rain made it worse, flattening the ground into slippery mush and obscuring visibility. Still, I had no choice but to push on. I decided to angle downhill, hoping to reconnect with the stream marked on my map. Water would give me both a landmark and a place to camp. The forest downhill was brutal. Fallen trees forced me to climb over or crawl under. Mud sucked at my boots, and thorny undergrowth clawed at my clothes. The rain blurred everything, turning the world into a curtain of gray and green. I stumbled more than once, sliding down slick patches, catching myself on branches. My pack felt twice as heavy now, straps digging into my shoulders, water soaking through despite the cover. As the light began to fade, panic itched at the edge of my mind. I needed to stop. Hiking in the dark in these conditions would be reckless. I searched desperately for a flat patch of ground. Eventually, I found one, a small clearing where the trees broke just enough to give space for my tent. I dropped my pack and set to work with trembling hands, forcing poles into muddy ground, pulling the rainfly tight. By the time it stood, my fingers were numb, and darkness was closing in. I crawled inside, peeled off my soaked jacket, and sat shivering. The storm raged outside, wind tearing through branches, rain hammering on the thin fabric. I boiled water with my small stove, ate a quick meal, and tried to calm my nerves. But sleep was hard. Every sound outside, the snap of a branch, the rush of wind, felt amplified, like something prowling just beyond the tent walls. I lay awake for hours, drifting in and out, my body tense, mind replaying the slip on the ridge, the near fall. Morning brought no relief. The storm had passed, but everything was soaked. Mist clung to the forest, cold and heavy, and the ground squelched under every step. I packed my gear, shouldered the damp weight, and set out downhill again, determined to find the stream. Hours passed, the forest unrelenting, and then finally I heard it, the faint sound of running water. Relief surged through me and I pushed toward it. The stream was swollen from rain, rushing fast, its banks soft and unstable. I crouched, refilled my bottles, and studied my map again. If I followed the stream downstream, it should eventually meet the trail again. It seemed simple, but the reality was brutal. The banks were uneven, and often I had to climb up steep ground or wade through thick brush to stay near the water. My progress slowed to a crawl, every step sapping energy. Still, I forced myself on, clinging to the thought that the stream would lead me out. By afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs burned, my shoulders ached, and every breath felt heavy. I slipped once crossing a wet log and landed hard, scraping my hip, the impact sending pain shooting up my side. I lay there for a moment, staring at the canopy above, rainwater dripping on my face from the branches. The weight of isolation pressed in. No one knew exactly where I was. If I got hurt badly, if I couldn't move, no one would find me quickly. That thought burned into me, driving me to stand, grit my teeth, and keep going. The hours dragged. I had been planning the hike for weeks. I had looked at the maps, checked the weather, and gone through all the gear I thought I might need. I wanted to do it alone because I felt like I needed some time away from everything and everyone. I thought being out in the mountains, far from noise, far from cars, far from people, would clear my head. I didn't want to rush the trail. I wanted to take it slow, take in every detail, and really feel what it was like to be out there with nothing but trees, dirt, and sky around me. The trail I picked wasn't one of the well-known ones. It wasn't in the guidebooks that people pass around for easy day hikes. This one was longer, steeper, and stretched deep into the mountains. I had found it after reading some online notes from other hikers who liked going to more remote places. They said it was beautiful but rough. They also said you could go hours without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. I started early in the morning. The air was still cold, and the light was soft. My backpack felt heavy, but I knew I had packed only what I needed: food, water, first aid, extra clothes, a headlamp, and my tent. I also had a small knife, a whistle, and my phone with a power bank. There was no signal out there, but I liked having it for photos and as a backup. The trail began easy. It was wide at first, with crushed gravel and clear markers. I could hear birds above me, and the sun slowly warmed the tops of the trees. I felt good, like my body was ready for this. I kept a steady pace, not rushing. I could see the shadows shifting as the sun climbed higher, and after the first hour, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew thicker and the air cooler. The sound of birds faded, replaced by the creak of branches and the sound of my own boots on the dirt. I knew I had a long way to go. The trail was supposed to loop around a ridge, follow a valley, and then climb back up to connect with another path that would bring me near where I had parked. I had planned to camp one night in the middle of it. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat area some hikers mentioned where you could set up a tent. By midday, I was deep in the woods. The sun barely reached the ground. Everything felt damp, the dirt, the air, even the bark of the trees. My shoulders ached from the pack, but I kept walking. I stopped every hour to drink water, and I ate a small snack while standing on the trail. I didn't like the idea of sitting too long because I didn't want to get lazy or let my muscles tighten up. It was in the early afternoon that I noticed the first thing that unsettled me. The trail split. It wasn't marked on the map I had printed, and it wasn't mentioned in the notes I had read online. One path curved down toward the valley like I expected, but another broke off to the left, climbing a little. It wasn't wide. It looked more like something animals had made, but it was clear enough that people must have used it at some point. I stood there for a few minutes trying to decide. I told myself to stick to the plan, so I went right down into the valley. But as I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about the other path. It was strange to see something that looked traveled but not recorded. My mind went back to it again and again, even as the trail dipped lower, even as I crossed a small stream and heard the rush of water echoing between rocks. By late afternoon, I reached the flat area I had read about. It wasn't much. A patch of dirt between trees, big enough for a tent and with a few stones that others had arranged into a circle for a fire. I set my bag down, stretched my back, and decided to set up camp before it got dark. My tent went up quickly. I laid out my sleeping bag and checked my food. I had enough for 2 days plus a little extra. The woods around me were quiet, too quiet. I sat on a rock and listened for a while. I expected birds or maybe the sound of a squirrel, but there was nothing, just the faint wind brushing against the tops of the trees. The silence made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that animals just moved differently at different times of day. When night came, I ate in silence, sitting cross-legged in front of my tent. I didn't make a fire because I didn't want the smell of smoke, and I didn't feel like gathering wood. I ate a simple meal from my pack, then cleaned up and stored everything in a bag tied to a branch away from the tent. I climbed inside and zipped myself in. I lay there for hours, staring at the fabric above me. I tried to sleep, but every sound caught my attention. The snap of a twig, the shift of leaves. My mind told me it was just small animals moving through the woods, but my chest stayed tight. I closed my eyes, breathed slowly, and finally drifted off. At some point in the night, I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't quick like a squirrel or rustling like a bird. It was heavier. I lay perfectly still, listening. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt under weight, the faint sound of something brushing against branches. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. I waited for it to pass, and eventually the sound faded. I don't know how long I lay there after that, but sleep didn't come back easily. When the morning light returned, I crawled out and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints I could see, no torn branches, no signs of animals close by. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe a deer had wandered through. I packed my things and started hiking again. My body was sore, but I kept moving. The trail wound deeper into the valley. Rocks lined the sides and the trees grew thicker. I checked my map again and again, making sure I was on the right track. Everything seemed to line up, but I couldn't shake the memory of the unmarked path from the day before. By afternoon, I reached a point where the trail should have started climbing back toward the ridge. But when I looked ahead, the path seemed to fade. The dirt track narrowed, grass began to cover sections, and soon I wasn't sure if I was even on it anymore. I pulled out my map again. It showed the trail curving up to the right, but the ground in front of me was nothing but uneven terrain and trees. I decided to backtrack a little, thinking maybe I had missed a turn. I walked for 20 minutes, scanning the ground, looking for markers, but nothing stood out. When I stopped to catch my breath, that's when I realized something else. I didn't hear anything anymore. Not the wind, not birds, not even the distant sound of water. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. A sick feeling started in my stomach. I told myself to stay calm. I still had water, food, and supplies. Even if I was off the main trail, I could use my compass and map to navigate back. I tried to focus on that, on being logical. But as I moved again, I started noticing small things that made me feel worse. Piles of branches stacked strangely, not like natural falls. Stones set in odd shapes on the ground. Once I even saw a tree with deep cuts in the bark, like someone had hacked at it with a blade. None of it looked like normal trail markers. Felt random, but also intentional. The sun dipped lower, and I knew I couldn't keep wandering. I had to set up camp again, even though the thought of staying another night out there made my chest tighten. I found a flat spot near a cluster of rocks and pitched my tent quickly. I ate a little, though I wasn't hungry, and stored the rest away. I crawled inside, zipped the tent, and sat there in the dim light, listening. That night was worse. I heard footsteps again, but this time they stopped close to my tent. I could hear breathing, slow and heavy. I froze, every muscle tense. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it might give me away. The sound lingered outside for what felt like forever. Then it moved on, fading into the woods. When morning came, I stepped outside and checked the ground. My stomach dropped when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, not animal but human. Bare feet. The prints circled my tent, close enough that whoever it was could have touched the fabric if they wanted. I felt sick. I wanted to pack up and run, but I forced myself to move carefully. I folded my tent, stuffed everything in my bag, and started walking quickly. I didn't even know if I was going the right way anymore. I just wanted to put distance between me and whatever had been out there. Hours passed. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my nerves were shot. I kept checking over my shoulder, sure I was being followed. Every snapped branch behind me made me whip around. I saw no one, but the feeling never left. As evening came, I finally saw something that gave me a shred of hope. A broken wooden sign nailed to a tree, half rotted but still standing. The letters were faded, but I could make out the name of a trail I recognized from my map. Relief hit me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I followed it, moving as fast as I could despite the weight on my back. By nightfall, I reached a wider path. This one was clear, with footprints from boots and marks from hiking poles. It meant other people used it, maybe not today, but enough that I wasn't alone anymore. I set up camp just off the side of the trail, too exhausted to go further. I slept badly, waking at every sound, but no one came near my tent that night. The next day, I hiked until my legs were shaking. Finally, I saw the outline of the trailhead through the trees. I had been planning that hiking trip for months, slowly collecting everything I thought I might need, packing and repacking my bag, testing my boots on shorter trails near home, checking maps until I nearly memorized every curve and elevation line. I wasn't new to hiking, but this trip was longer than what I usually did. I wanted to push myself to go out alone for several days in the backcountry, carrying everything on my back and seeing how I handled it. I was 31 that year, and though I considered myself in decent shape, I wasn't an athlete or a survival expert. Still, the idea of going off alone into the mountains felt like something I needed to do, to prove to myself that I could. The area I picked was a stretch of trail that cut through national forest land and rose into higher ground before looping back around toward a lake where I planned to spend my last night. It wasn't an official through hike, but the trail had some challenging climbs, long stretches without water, and thick wooded areas where navigation mattered. I had read about it online, seen trip reports from other hikers, and though they warned about bears, rough weather, and steep terrain, nothing in the reports sounded like something I couldn't handle with preparation. I set out on a cool morning in late September. The sky was gray but calm, and the air carried that dry, crisp edge that meant autumn had really arrived. The leaves in the lower forest had just begun turning, patches of yellow and red standing out against the darker evergreens. I parked my car at a small dirt pullout where the trail began and tightened my pack straps one last time. It felt heavy, but I had trimmed it down as much as I dared. Extra clothes, food, stove, tent, sleeping bag, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight, and a knife. The basics. I had tucked in a few emergency items too, just in case: whistle, signal mirror, space blanket. The first miles were easy, and I settled into a rhythm quickly, walking at a steady pace, listening to the crunch of gravel and fallen leaves under my boots. The trail wound gently upward through tall trees, the ground damp from recent rain, though the sky above remained clear. I remember feeling strong, optimistic, even excited to finally be out there after all that planning. As the hours went by, the trail grew steeper. My breathing deepened, sweat dampened my shirt beneath my jacket, and the pack straps dug harder into my shoulders. I stopped often to sip water and check my map. The forest thickened around me, branches closing in overhead so the light dimmed, and the air grew cooler. By midday, clouds had rolled in, heavier than before, muting the sunlight until the woods looked flat and colorless. I had hoped to make it to a high ridge before setting camp, but the climb was slower than I thought, and my legs ached more than I wanted to admit. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing off the trail, a patch of relatively flat ground tucked between dense stands of spruce. I decided to stop there for the night. The clearing wasn't ideal. Narrow, uneven, with roots crisscrossing the ground. But I was tired and didn't want to push on too far in case I struggled to find another flat space before dark. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and began setting up the tent. It was during that first night that I realized how different it felt being alone so deep in the woods. I had camped alone before, but always near busier trails where the occasional distant voice or bark of a dog reminded me that others were close. Here, there was only silence broken by the wind shifting through trees and the occasional crack of a branch far off. I cooked a simple meal, ate quickly, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag as the last light faded. The temperature dropped sharply, and I lay there listening, every sound magnified by the darkness. I thought about bears, about the possibility of one wandering through, drawn by the smell of food. I had stored my food properly, hanging it away from camp, but the unease lingered. Sleep came in short bursts, light and uneasy. The second day started gray again. I packed quickly, anxious to cover more miles and reach the ridge. The trail steepened even more, zigzagging upward across rocky ground, and I had to slow my pace often, stopping to catch my breath, heart hammering hard. The higher I climbed, the colder the air grew, and a mist drifted through the trees until the forest looked ghostly, trunks fading into pale gray vapor. At times, visibility dropped so low I could barely see 20 feet ahead. My compass and map came out often, and I checked them obsessively, worried about veering off trail in the fog. Midway through the day, I came across a section where the trail had eroded badly. A steep drop opened to one side, the ground crumbling where past hikers had stepped too close to the edge. I had to pick my way carefully, each step slow, my boots sliding slightly on loose gravel. My pack shifted my balance, and the sense of how easy it would be to fall gnawed at me. I pressed close to the inner wall of the trail, hands brushing against the damp rock face until I passed through and returned to safer ground. That night, I camped near the ridge. I found a flatter spot this time, though the wind tore across the higher ground and shook my tent violently through the night. Sleep again came in fragments, interrupted by the sound of gusts rushing through trees and the repeated flap of nylon. When I did drift off, I woke often, heart racing, certain I had heard footsteps outside, though each time it was only the restless forest. The third day turned worse. I woke to steady rain, heavy and cold, soaking everything within minutes. My jacket kept me mostly dry, but my boots grew damp quickly, and each step squelched with water. The trail descended slightly from the ridge, winding into thicker woods again, the ground turning to mud. I slipped more than once, catching myself on branches. Progress slowed and frustration built. I checked the map repeatedly, trying to reassure myself I was still on course, but the rain blurred details, and I worried I had missed a turn. At one point, the trail simply vanished beneath fallen branches and thick undergrowth. I pushed through, convinced I was still on the right path, but doubt grew heavier with each step. The forest here felt different, darker, thicker, as if the canopy had closed completely overhead. The ground was soft and uneven, and the further I went, the less I saw of any clear trail. Panic began to build, that tight, rising pressure in the chest when you know something isn't right but can't yet admit it fully. By late afternoon, the rain had eased, but mist clung to the ground, and I had to face the truth. I was off the trail. I tried backtracking, searching for signs of where I had gone wrong, but the forest looked the same in every direction. My footprints in the mud vanished quickly in the wet ground, and every tree looked like the last. I checked the compass again, tried to orient myself toward where the trail should have been, but each time I thought I had it right, the ground grew harder to cross, tangled with roots and thick brush. I decided to stop before it grew fully dark. I pitched my tent on the wet ground, the forest pressing in on all sides, and sat inside, shivering from damp clothes and exhaustion. Fear settled in more heavily than before. I knew that losing the trail wasn't automatically life-threatening. I had food, water, and gear, but it was a dangerous turn. Panic could push me to make worse mistakes. I forced myself to eat, even though my stomach churned, and tried to think clearly about how to find my way back the next morning. But the night was terrible. Couldn't sleep. The forest sounded different there, closer, as if everything pressed in around the thin fabric of the tent. Branches snapped often, sometimes far, sometimes near, sharp cracks that jolted me upright each time. My flashlight beam caught nothing but trees, trunks slick with rain, mist swirling between them. At some point in the night, I realized I was gripping my knife without remembering drawing it out. My hands trembled, and my mouth was dry no matter how much water I sipped. The next morning, I tried again. I packed everything and set out with the compass, aiming to move back west toward where I believed the trail should be. The forest was a maze. Fallen trees forced me to detour constantly, streams cut across my path, and the ground rose and fell unpredictably. Hours passed, and I saw no sign of the trail. My food supply was now a concern. I had enough for maybe 3 more days if I rationed carefully. The weight of that fact settled into every decision. The scariest moment came late that day. I was crossing a steep slope, the ground slick with wet leaves, when my boots slipped and I fell hard. My body slid several feet before I caught myself on a root. My pack had shifted, nearly pulling me further down the slope toward a drop I couldn't see clearly through the trees. I sat there for a long time, heart hammering, legs shaking, realizing how close I had come to tumbling down into who knew what. My hip throbbed where I had landed, and though I could still walk, the pain grew worse with each step. That night, I didn't bother with the tent. I was too exhausted to set it up. I pulled the sleeping bag around me beneath a tree, though dampness seeped in quickly. Sleep was shallow, restless, broken by cold and fear. The following day, it was late summer when I decided to take a long hike through a mountain range I hadn't visited before. The area was known for its rough trails, sharp ridgelines, and thick forests that stretched for miles without a single road cutting through. It was the kind of place where people said you could walk for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. I had been stressed for months, and the idea of spending several days in the backcountry with only a backpack, a tent, and my own thoughts sounded perfect. I had packed carefully. I carried a small tent, a sleeping bag, a lightweight stove, and 3 days' worth of food. I had a filter for water and a map folded tightly in a waterproof case. The plan was simple. Start on a known trail, follow it deep into the mountains, camp 2 nights, then loop back out. I told myself it was safe. I told myself I was experienced enough to handle it. The first morning was calm and cool. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked it, and shouldered my pack. The dirt lot was empty. There were no other cars, no noise except for the rustle of trees in the breeze. I walked past the wooden sign at the start of the trail. The letters faded and cracked with age, and stepped onto the narrow path that led into the forest. At first, the trail was easy. The dirt was firm, the trees spaced wide apart, and the air smelled of pine. I hiked steadily, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching against gravel and dry needles. My pack was heavy, but it was balanced. I stopped once to drink from my bottle, refilled it from a creek, filtered the water, and kept going. By midday, the sun was high and hot, but the shade kept me comfortable. I felt strong. As the afternoon went on, the trail grew rougher. Roots tangled underfoot, rocks jutted out at sharp angles, and the grade grew steeper. I checked my map more often, tracing my finger over the contour lines. Everything seemed to line up. The ridge I planned to reach before dark was still several miles away, but I was making good time. By late evening, I set up camp in a small clearing near the base of the ridge. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, cooked a simple meal of noodles, and sat outside while the light faded. The forest grew quiet as the sky turned orange, then purple, then black. I zipped myself inside, laid on my sleeping bag, and listened to the faint hum of insects. I slept deeply that first night. The next morning was different. I woke early, packed quickly, and started climbing toward the ridge. The trail was harder to follow now. Grass had grown over parts of it, branches blocked sections, and the path twisted through thick brush. I checked my map again. According to the markings, the trail would lead me up to the ridge, then across to a small valley where a creek flowed. That creek would be my water source. Hours passed as I climbed. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and the straps of my pack rubbed against my shoulders. The higher I went, the narrower the path became. Sometimes it disappeared completely, forcing me to guess where it picked up again. Each time I found it eventually, but it started to bother me. Trails that are marked on a map are supposed to be clear. This one felt like it hadn't been used in years. By afternoon, I reached the ridge. The view opened wide, and I could see the mountains stretching endlessly in all directions. Peaks rolled into the distance, jagged and sharp. The forest looked endless. For a moment, I felt very small. I followed the ridge line down toward the valley. The map said there would be water there, and I needed it. My bottle was low, and the heat had drained me. The trail dipped steeply, winding through loose rock. I slipped twice, catching myself on branches. When I reached the valley floor, I searched for the creek, but it was dry. The ground was cracked and dusty. A shallow depression marked where water should have flowed, but not a drop remained. I crouched, touched the dirt, and felt only powder. My mouth was already dry, and panic prickled in the back of my mind. The map was old, Maybe the creek hadn't run in years. I sat on a log, pulled out my map again, and studied it. Another creek lay several miles to the east, if the markings were right. I could reach it before dark if I moved quickly. I forced myself up, adjusted my pack, and started walking. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, pressed into the dirt along the same path I had taken. Human footprints. The edges were sharp, not weathered. Someone else had been there recently. I crouched down and studied them. The prints were larger than mine, the stride longer. They led in the same direction I was heading. I kept walking. At first, I thought it might comfort me to know someone else was out there. But the deeper I went, the less I liked it. The footprints never left the trail. They matched my every turn. And there were no other signs of life. No voices, no gear, no distant figures moving among the trees. Just prints. I moved faster. The forest thickened as I pushed east. Branches clawed at my arms. Leaves brushed against my face, and the undergrowth tangled around my legs. I was sweating hard, my throat aching for water. Every time I looked down, I saw those prints, always ahead of me, always going the same way. When the sun began to set, I finally heard it, the faint trickle of water. Relief surged through me. I stumbled toward the sound and found the creek. It wasn't wide, but it was flowing. I dropped to my knees, scooped cold water into my filter, and drank until my stomach ached. The water tasted like life itself. I set up camp near the bank. My body was exhausted, but I felt safer knowing I had water. I built no fire, just ate a cold meal from my pack and crawled into my tent. The ground was uneven, but I didn't care. My eyes closed quickly. In the middle of the night, I woke. A sound had carried through the forest, a branch snapping. My eyes opened wide in the darkness, and I froze. I listened hard. The forest was quiet, except for the creek nearby. Then another sound came. Slow, deliberate steps, leaves crunching under weight. I held my breath. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I waited, every muscle locked. After a long time, nothing more came. I forced myself to breathe again, but I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, ears straining for any sound. When dawn came, I packed quickly. I wanted out. I checked my map. If I pushed hard, I could cut across a narrow pass and reach a main trail that would lead me back toward the trailhead. It would take a full day, maybe longer, but it was the fastest route. I started walking. The trail was faint, overgrown, but I followed it. My legs burned, my back ached, but I kept moving. I wanted to be gone from that valley. I wanted to be back on solid ground, near people, near safety. Hours passed. The sun beat down and I rationed my water carefully. My food was running low, but I didn't care. I just needed out. Then I saw it. On the ground ahead, pressed into the dirt, were the same footprints. Larger than mine, heading in the same direction. Fresh. My stomach sank. I slowed, staring at the prints. They hadn't been there the day before. Whoever made them had walked this path recently. Maybe even that morning. I kept going, but now every sound made my skin crawl. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I checked behind me often, but the trail was empty. By late afternoon, I reached the pass. It was steep, rocky, and narrow. The trail wound upward between sharp cliffs. I climbed carefully, hands gripping stone, boots scraping against loose gravel. At the top, the wind whipped hard, carrying the scent of pine and dust. I looked down the other side and froze. Far below, in the dirt of the trail, I saw a camp. A small one, just a tarp strung between two trees, a pack leaning against a trunk, and the faint glow of a smoldering fire. It was directly on the route I had to take. I crouched low, heart pounding. My throat was dry again, but I didn't move. I stared at the camp, wondering who it belonged to, wondering if it belonged to the person leaving those prints. The longer I watched, the more uneasy I felt. The camp looked wrong. Too bare, too temporary. No tent, no sleeping bag laid out, no signs of cooking gear. Just a tarp, a pack, and a fire that looked like it had been left burning on purpose. I stayed on the ridge until dark. My body ached from crouching, but I didn't move. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to walk past that camp. When the last light faded, I made my choice. I cut off the trail. I pushed into the forest, moving away from the valley, away from the camp. The brush tore at my arms, branches whipped against my face, but I kept going. My legs shook with exhaustion, but fear kept me upright. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I just found a hollow beneath some trees, laid on the ground, and pulled my sleeping bag around me. I barely slept. It was late summer when I decided to take a long hike through a mountain range I hadn't visited before. The area was known for its rough trails, sharp ridgelines, and thick forests that stretched for miles without a single road cutting through. It was the kind of place where people said you could walk for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. I had been stressed for months, and the idea of spending several days in the backcountry with only a backpack, a tent, and my own thoughts sounded perfect. I had packed carefully. I carried a small tent, a sleeping bag, a lightweight stove, and 3 days' worth of food. I had a filter for water and a map folded tightly in a waterproof case. The plan was simple. Start on a known trail, follow it deep into the mountains, camp 2 nights, then loop back out. I told myself it was safe. I told myself I was experienced enough to handle it. The first morning was calm and cool. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked it, and shouldered my pack. The dirt lot was empty. There were no other cars, no noise except for the rustle of trees in the breeze. I walked past the wooden sign at the start of the trail. The letters faded and cracked with age, and stepped onto the narrow path that led into the forest. First, the trail was easy. The dirt was firm, the trees spaced wide apart, and the air smelled of pine. I hiked steadily, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching against gravel and dry needles. My pack was heavy, but it was balanced. I stopped once to drink from my bottle, refilled it from a creek, filtered the water, and kept going. By midday, the sun was high and hot, but the shade kept me comfortable. I felt strong. As the afternoon went on, the trail grew rougher. Roots tangled underfoot, rocks jutted out at sharp angles, and the grade grew steeper. I checked my map more often, tracing my finger over the contour lines. Everything seemed to line up. The ridge I planned to reach before dark was still several miles away, but I was making good time. By late evening, I set up camp in a small clearing near the base of the ridge. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, cooked a simple meal of noodles, and sat outside while the light faded. The forest grew quiet as the sky turned orange, then purple, then black. I zipped myself inside, laid on my sleeping bag, and listened to the faint hum of insects. I slept deeply that first night. The next morning was different. I woke early, packed quickly, and started climbing toward the ridge. The trail was harder to follow now. Grass had grown over parts of it, branches blocked sections, and the path twisted through thick brush. I checked my map again. According to the markings, the trail would lead me up to the ridge, then across to a small valley where a creek flowed. That creek would be my water source. Hours passed as I climbed. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and the straps of my pack rubbed against my shoulders. The higher I went, the narrower the path became. Sometimes it disappeared completely, forcing me to guess where it picked up again. Each time I found it eventually, but it started to bother me. Trails that are marked on a map are supposed to be clear. This one felt like it hadn't been used in years. By afternoon, I reached the ridge. The view opened wide, and I could see the mountains stretching endlessly in all directions. Peaks rolled into the distance, jagged and sharp. The forest looked endless. For a moment, I felt very small. I followed the ridge line down toward the valley. The map said there would be water there, and I needed it. My bottle was low, and the heat had drained me. The trail dipped steeply, winding through loose rock. I slipped twice, catching myself on branches. When I reached the valley floor, I searched for the creek, but it was dry. The ground was cracked and dusty. A shallow depression marked where water should have flowed, but not a drop remained. I crouched, touched the dirt, and felt only powder. My mouth was already dry, and panic prickled in the back of my mind. The map was old. Maybe the creek hadn't run in years. I sat on a log, pulled out my map again, and studied it. Another creek lay several miles to the east, if the markings were right. I could reach it before dark if I moved quickly. I forced myself up, adjusted my pack, and started walking. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, pressed into the dirt along the same path I had taken. Human footprints. The edges were sharp, not weathered. Someone else had been there recently. I crouched down and studied them. The prints were larger than mine, the stride longer. They led in the same direction I was heading. I kept walking. At first, I thought it might comfort me to know someone else was out there. But the deeper I went, the less I liked it. The footprints never left the trail. They matched my every turn. And there were no other signs of life. No voices, no gear, no distant figures moving among the trees. Just prints. I moved faster. The forest thickened as I pushed east. Branches clawed at my arms. Leaves brushed against my face, and the undergrowth tangled around my legs. I was sweating hard, my throat aching for water. Every time I looked down, I saw those prints, always ahead of me, always going the same way. When the sun began to set, I finally heard it, the faint trickle of water. Relief surged through me. I stumbled toward the sound and found the creek. It wasn't wide, but it was flowing. I dropped to my knees, scooped cold water into my filter, and drank until my stomach ached. The water tasted like life itself. I set up camp near the bank. My body was exhausted, but I felt safer knowing I had water. I built no fire, just ate a cold meal from my pack and crawled into my tent. The ground was uneven, but I didn't care. My eyes closed quickly. In the middle of the night, I woke. A sound had carried through the forest, a branch snapping. My eyes opened wide in the darkness, and I froze. I listened hard. The forest was quiet, except for the creek nearby. Then another sound came. Slow, deliberate steps, leaves crunching under weight. I held my breath. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I waited, every muscle locked. After a long time, nothing more came. I forced myself to breathe again, but I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, ears straining for any sound. When dawn came, I packed quickly. I wanted out. I checked my map. If I pushed hard, I could cut across a narrow pass and reach a main trail that would lead me back toward the trailhead. It would take a full day, maybe longer, but it was the fastest route. I started walking. The trail was faint, overgrown, but I followed it. My legs burned, my back ached, but I kept moving. I wanted to be gone from that valley. I wanted to be back on solid ground, near people, near safety. Hours passed. The sun beat down and I rationed my water carefully. My food was running low, but I didn't care. I just needed out. Then I saw it. On the ground ahead, pressed into the dirt, were the same footprints. Larger than mine, heading in the same direction. Fresh. My stomach sank. I slowed, staring at the prints. They hadn't been there the day before. Whoever made them had walked this path recently, maybe even that morning. I kept going, but now every sound made my skin crawl. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I checked behind me often, but the trail was empty. By late afternoon, I reached the pass. It was steep, rocky, and narrow. The trail wound upward between sharp cliffs. I climbed carefully, hands gripping stone, boots scraping against loose gravel. At the top, the wind whipped hard, carrying the scent of pine and dust. I looked down the other side and froze. Far below, in the dirt of the trail, I saw a camp. A small one, just a tarp strung between two trees, a pack leaning against a trunk, and the faint glow of a smoldering fire. It was directly on the route I had to take. I crouched low, heart pounding. My throat was dry again, but I didn't move. I stared at the camp, wondering who it belonged to, wondering if it belonged to the person leaving those prints. The longer I watched, the more uneasy I felt. The camp looked wrong. Too bare, too temporary. No tent, no sleeping bag laid out, no signs of cooking gear. Just a tarp, a pack, and a fire that looked like it had been left burning on purpose. I stayed on the ridge until dark. My body ached from crouching, but I didn't move. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to walk past that camp. When the last light faded, I made my choice. I cut off the trail. I pushed into the forest, moving away from the valley, away from the camp. The brush tore at my arms, branches whipped against my face, but I kept going. My legs shook with exhaustion, but fear kept me upright. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I just found a hollow beneath some trees, laid on the ground, and pulled my sleeping bag around me. I barely slept. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of getting out into the mountains, away from traffic, noise, and endless screens had been eating at me all summer. When the weather finally lined up, I packed up my gear, filled my backpack with what I thought I would need, and drove out early in the morning toward a long trail system I had only read about online. The trail was supposed to stretch for miles, weaving up and down ridges, cutting through dense forest, and following the bend of a river that carved its way between valleys. I had read some mixed reviews about it. Some people said it was breathtaking, the kind of hike you never forgot, while others said it was hard to stay on the trail because it was poorly marked. That should have been a bigger warning to me than it was, but I shrugged it off. I had done dozens of hikes before. I felt like I could handle myself. When I parked near the trailhead, I noticed that only a few other cars were in the small gravel lot. The air was cool, the sky was partly cloudy, and the trees surrounding the lot swayed in the breeze. I shouldered my pack and started walking, the gravel crunching under my boots, my excitement stronger than any hesitation. The first few miles were easy. The path was wide enough to see clearly, and the forest on both sides looked untouched, quiet except for the constant buzzing of insects. I could hear birds above me, but I rarely saw them, just flashes of movement between branches. The trail climbed slowly, winding around rocks and roots, and I found myself sweating before long. I stopped a few times to drink water and wipe the sweat from my forehead. As the morning stretched into midday, I realized I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail since I started. I thought maybe people had taken other connecting paths or had gone out earlier. Still, there was something strange about being so alone out there. I had expected to pass at least a couple more hikers. The silence was heavier the deeper I went, broken only by my own footsteps, the occasional crack of a branch under my boot, and the far-off calls of crows. I kept moving, pushing myself to cover ground before it got late. The sky had shifted from partly cloudy to mostly cloudy, and I noticed the wind picking up, carrying a faint dampness with it. I figured rain might be on the way, but I had a rain jacket stuffed in my pack. That wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was how the trail seemed to narrow, twist, and fade as the miles went on. By mid-afternoon, the path became less obvious. At times, I found myself guessing where the trail continued. A few old blazes on trees helped me for a while, but they were faded, chipped, and so far apart that I had to stop often, scan the woods, and pick a direction that looked right. More than once, I had to backtrack after realizing I had gone too far the wrong way. It was during one of these moments of backtracking that I felt the first chill crawl up my spine. I had stopped in a clearing to check my map and take a drink of water. When I glanced up, I thought I saw movement farther up the slope, maybe 30 yards away. It looked like a shape slipping between the trees. My first thought was a deer, but the movement didn't feel like that. It was upright, quick, and gone before I could focus. I tried to shake it off. Plenty of animals moved differently depending on what they were doing. The forest was full of life, and being alone made every small thing feel bigger than it was. I told myself not to be paranoid, zipped up my pack, and kept walking. The farther I went, the less the trail made sense. Roots had pulled up parts of it, leaves covered other sections, and in some areas it just seemed to vanish into the underbrush. I had to fight through thorny bushes, step over logs, and duck under branches that clawed at my jacket. Each step took more energy, and I started to realize I had underestimated how hard this was going to be. When the first drops of rain began to fall, I cursed under my breath. The canopy caught most of it, but enough slipped through to speckle my shoulders and darken the dirt. Soon the light drizzle turned into steady rain, and the ground softened. I pulled on my rain jacket and kept moving, but everything became harder. The dirt turned to mud, roots slicked over, and rocks were dangerous to step on. I glanced at my watch and realized I was running out of time. The plan had been to hike a loop that would bring me back near the parking lot before dark. But now I wasn't sure if I was even on the loop anymore. I tried to check my phone, but the signal was gone, just as I had expected in the middle of the mountains. I thought about turning back, but the path behind me looked just as confusing as the one ahead. Every direction seemed wrong. I decided to push on a little farther, hoping I would find a clear marking or maybe hear the river that the trail was supposed to follow. The rain kept falling. My boots grew heavy with mud, and my legs ached from climbing and sliding. The woods darkened even though it was still afternoon. The storm clouds above turned everything gray, and shadows stretched between the trees like bars. That was when I saw it again. I had stopped near a fallen log to rest my legs. When I lifted my head, I caught sight of movement again, higher up the slope. A figure taller than I had expected stood between two trees. This time it didn't vanish right away. It lingered for a moment, and I felt my stomach tighten as I realized it wasn't a deer or a bear. It looked like a person, but they weren't moving like a hiker. They weren't carrying a pack. They weren't wearing bright clothes. They just stood there watching. I blinked, and in that moment the figure slipped back behind the trees, gone as quickly as before. My heart pounded in my chest, and I told myself it had to be another hiker who had gotten turned around like me. But then why wouldn't they call out? Why wouldn't they try to make themselves known? The rain pattered harder. I felt exposed in the open and pushed myself to move faster. Each step squelched in the mud, and branches whipped at my face as I tried to make progress. I checked behind me often now, convinced I would see something following. But every time, there was nothing. Just wet trees, dripping leaves, and the thick silence of the forest. Hours passed like this. The trail was gone completely now. I was no longer hiking. I was stumbling through wild forest, trying to piece together direction by instinct alone. My legs were trembling, and hunger gnawed at me, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. The way it had stood, so still, so silent, made my skin crawl. As dusk began to fall, the rain finally eased, but fog rolled in low and heavy. It hung between the trunks, hiding everything beyond a few yards. My world shrank to gray mist and the uneven ground at my feet. I could hear the sound of water nearby, the rush of the river, and I staggered toward it. If I could follow it downstream, maybe it would lead me to a road or back to the trailhead. The fog made it worse. I would take a few steps, then stop, listening, convinced I heard something behind me. Once I froze completely because I heard a snap of a branch close by. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing followed. I moved again, faster this time, my nerves raw and fraying. The river was swollen from the rain, brown water churning, carrying branches and foam. I kept close enough to follow it, but far enough not to slip into it. I thought if I stayed near it long enough, I would be fine. But then I saw footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the wet ground. Human footprints, barefoot. The toes clear, the heels sunk deep. They led along the river in the same direction I was going. My mouth went dry. Who would be walking barefoot out here in the rain, miles from anywhere? My hands shook as I adjusted my pack straps, and I felt the weight of my own footsteps as I followed the prints unwillingly. Each one looked newer than the last, as if I was catching up. The fear ate at me. I wanted to turn and run, but where would I go? The forest was endless. I forced myself to keep moving, heart hammering in my chest. When full darkness fell, I knew I couldn't go on much longer. I was too exhausted, too cold, and too shaken to keep stumbling through the fog. I found a patch of ground under a cluster of trees where the canopy was thicker, giving me some shelter, and I forced myself to stop. I set down my pack, pulled out my emergency blanket, and tried to settle. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there shivering, every sound magnified in the night. Raindrops hitting leaves, the distant rush of the river, the creak of trees swaying in the wind, and sometimes the faint crunch of something moving on the wet ground. I don't know if I slept at all. My eyes burned, my body ached, and every time I thought I drifted off, I jolted awake again, convinced I had heard footsteps. When the first gray light of dawn finally pushed through the trees, I sat up, sore and hollow, and forced myself to move again. The footprints were still there in the mud, and they looked fresher than ever. My stomach turned, and I knew I had to get out. I followed the river for hours, pushing myself harder than I thought possible, until finally, I saw a bridge in the distance. A wooden bridge spanning the water, and beyond it, the faint outline of a dirt road. I nearly collapsed from relief. I had always liked being outdoors. Hiking had been my way of clearing my head since I was in my late teens. I never cared much for gyms or crowded places. Walking into the woods with nothing but a backpack, a trail map, and the sound of my boots hitting the dirt gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. I wasn't the kind of person who chased danger, and I didn't go looking for thrills, but I liked the feeling of being alone far from the noise of cars and phones. The trip I'm about to describe was different from all my other hikes. It started like any other weekend hike, but it ended in a way I'll never forget. It was in early September. The air was cooler, but the sun was still strong enough during the day to make me sweat if I pushed too hard. I had planned to hike a trail I hadn't done before. It was in a national forest about 2 hours from where I lived. The trail wasn't extremely popular, which was what made me choose it. I liked paths where you could walk for hours and not run into more than 1 or 2 people. I packed light water, snacks, a knife, a flashlight, a lighter, a rolled-up poncho in case of rain, and a small first aid kit. I also carried a map of the forest and a compass. I wasn't new to hiking, and I liked to be prepared. The trail was supposed to loop around and then connect back near the parking area. The total distance was listed at about 12 miles. I figured I could do it in a single day if I started early, which I did. I parked my car in the small dirt lot at about 7 a.m., adjusted my backpack straps, and started walking. At first, the trail was wide and well-kept. The morning sun filtered through tall trees, the air smelled sharp and clean, and the sound of birds filled the forest. I kept a steady pace, not rushing, just moving with a rhythm. For the first couple of hours, everything was calm. The trail sloped up and down through hills, and I stopped here and there to drink water and check my map. Around noon, I reached a fork where the loop split. I checked my map and saw that the left path was longer and wound deeper into the forest before circling back, while the right one cut shorter. Since I still felt strong and the day was clear, I decided to take the longer route. That choice is something I still think about. As I continued, the trail grew thinner. The dirt path was still there, but roots and rocks made it rougher. I noticed fewer trail markers nailed to trees. I wasn't too worried. I had a compass, and I made sure the general direction matched the loop. After about another 2 hours, I realized I hadn't seen another hiker since the morning. That wasn't strange in itself. I had chosen this trail for its seclusion, but the silence began to settle heavier around me. The forest seemed deeper, the trees taller, and the undergrowth thicker. The breeze barely moved, and even the bird calls seemed to fade. I kept moving, but as the hours passed, I began to feel something I don't usually feel on hikes: unease. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow tightening in my stomach. I brushed it off at first as being tired. I had been walking for hours, and sweat soaked my shirt. Around 3 p.m., I checked my map again. The trail didn't quite match up with what I was seeing. According to the paper, I should have been coming around the far side of the loop, but the path I was on seemed to stretch farther without curving. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I had misjudged my pace, maybe I had more distance left than I thought. The ground dipped into a gully, and that's where I noticed the first real problem. The trail markings were gone. For the last half mile, I hadn't seen a single painted blaze or nailed marker. I stopped and scanned the trees moving in slow circles. Nothing. I felt a quick pulse of worry. Trails didn't just stop marking themselves. I pulled out my map again. held it flat on my thigh, and turned my compass. I tried to line it up with the landmarks, but the forest was too dense. No ridges or obvious points stuck out, just endless trees. I decided to backtrack. It was the safe thing to do. I turned around and began walking the way I had come. I counted my steps, checked behind me, and looked for anything familiar. But after 10 minutes, something unsettling hit me. I wasn't recognizing the trees or rocks I passed. I stopped and turned slowly, scanning. My footprints in the dirt were faint and scattered because the ground was packed harder here. I walked another 10 minutes, faster now, but the same problem remained. Nothing looked familiar. I crouched down, breathing hard, and tried to calm myself. I wasn't completely lost, I told myself. I had my compass. The map showed the parking lot was to the southwest. If I kept moving steadily in that direction, I should hit one of the main roads or trails. I set the compass, adjusted my pack, and started moving southwest. I pushed through brush, ducked under branches, and forced my way around fallen logs. The ground sloped downward, and I moved carefully to keep my footing. An hour passed, then another. The sun had lowered behind the trees, and the light turned orange. I checked my compass again, still southwest, but nothing changed. No road, no trail, just more forest. By 6 p.m., my legs ached and my water was running low. I stopped at a fallen tree to rest. The silence pressed heavy. That was when I heard it, the first sound that wasn't mine. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight, came from somewhere behind me. I froze, holding my breath. My mind ran through the possibilities. Deer, maybe a bear, maybe just another hiker. But I hadn't seen another person all day. I waited, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I stood up slowly, tightened the straps on my backpack, and kept walking. My pace quickened. Every few minutes I glanced behind me, half expecting to see something. The forest grew darker, the air cooler. I knew I needed to think about shelter. Hiking after dark without a trail was asking for broken ankles or worse. I found a spot where two large boulders leaned together with space underneath. I cleared sticks and leaves, sat down, and dug out my flashlight. I had packed extra batteries, but I wanted to save them, so I used the fading daylight as long as I could. When full dark came, the forest changed. The silence was broken by faint rustles, the cries of distant animals, and the occasional thump of something moving unseen. Every noise made me stiffen. I wasn't new to camping, but this wasn't the same. I hadn't planned to sleep out here. I didn't build a fire. I was afraid of drawing attention, whether from animals or whoever might have been snapping branches earlier. Instead, I ate a granola bar, drank a small amount of water, and sat with my flashlight resting on my knee. That night felt endless. I dozed in short bursts, jerking awake at sounds I couldn't place. At one point, I swore I heard faint, steady footsteps circling far through the trees. Not running, not rushing, just moving with a rhythm. Every hair on my body stood on end. Morning finally came, and the light filtered through the trees. I was stiff, tired, and thirsty. I pulled out my map again, though it felt almost useless. Still, I stuck to my plan, southwest. By noon, my legs were weak. My water was nearly gone. I began to wonder if I had somehow missed the loop completely and walked into another section of forest not covered by my map. That afternoon, I saw something that nearly made my knees give out. A boot print in the dirt, clear and recent. My heart leapt. I followed it, then saw another. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, heading in the same general direction I was going. I sped up, following the tracks. But after about half a mile, they stopped. Just ended in a patch of pine needles. I searched in circles, crouched, brushed the ground. Nothing. It was like whoever made them had vanished. I felt panic rising, but I forced myself to keep moving. Hours passed. The sun lowered again. My throat was dry, my head light. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on trees. As darkness came again, I knew I had to stop. My flashlight beam cut only small holes in the dark. I leaned against a thick tree, shivering despite the mild air. My stomach twisted with hunger, but I didn't eat. I wanted to save what little I had left. That night was worse. The noises were closer. At one point, I woke to a heavy thud not far off. Then a dragging sound, slow and rough. I didn't move, barely breathed. My flashlight stayed off. When morning came, I was shaking. I felt sick, my lips cracked, my body weak. I forced myself to stand, to walk, to keep moving southwest. It was mid-afternoon when I finally broke through the trees and saw something that made me cry out in a dry, broken voice. A dirt road, not paved, but wide enough for trucks. Relief crashed over me so hard I nearly collapsed. I stumbled onto the road and followed it. For 2 miles, maybe more. My legs were numb, my feet blistered. Finally, I saw a ranger's truck parked by a gate. When I reached it, the ranger stared at me wide-eyed. I must have looked terrible. My face was sunburned, my lips split, my clothes torn from brush. I always thought I was careful in the outdoors. I grew up hiking, camping, and spending long days in the woods. Over the years, I had learned the basics of safety: bring extra water, know the route, let someone know where you're going, carry a map and compass even if you have GPS. I had taken all that advice to heart, or at least I thought I had. That's probably why what happened that day on the trail shook me so deeply. It wasn't a supernatural thing, it wasn't something you could explain away with ghosts or myths. It was simply what can happen when you underestimate the woods, when you misjudge how quickly things can go wrong, and when you realize you're not nearly as in control as you believed. The hike I chose that weekend was one I hadn't done before. It was in a range of low mountains about 2 hours from where I lived. The trail wasn't one of the more popular ones, which was part of why I picked it. I liked solitude, and I didn't enjoy crowded trails where you were always stepping aside for someone or hearing groups of people laughing ahead of you. I liked the quiet, the long stretches where it felt like the forest belonged only to me. That morning was cool but not cold. I parked my car at a gravel pull-off near the trailhead, where only one other car sat. The woods looked thick, the trees tall and close together, the undergrowth dense. I slung my pack over my shoulders, checked that I had my water bottles, some food, a small first aid kit, my phone, and a paper map I had printed. Everything felt in order. The trail itself started out clear and easy. A dirt path cut between the trees, climbing gradually but nothing too steep. The sun filtered down through the leaves, making patterns on the ground. At first, it was peaceful. I walked steadily, enjoying the air, the smell of damp earth and pine, the sound of birds. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of something moving in the brush. It felt like a perfect hike. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed 2 routes, one that looped around and eventually came back to the parking area, and another that climbed further into the ridge, a longer out-and-back trail that ended near an overlook. I decided to take the longer one. I figured I had plenty of daylight, and I wanted a challenge. As I moved deeper, the trail narrowed. It was still marked, but the trees pressed in closer, and I had to pay more attention to my footing. Roots jutted up, rocks stuck out at angles, and the ground was damp from rain earlier in the week. I noticed fewer signs of people here. The path looked less used, as if most hikers didn't bother with this section. The sense of being alone grew heavier. Normally I enjoyed that, but something about the stillness unsettled me. There were no distant voices, no sounds of traffic, nothing but the forest pressing in. Every time I stopped, I realized how quiet it was. Even the birds seemed sparse. I brushed it off as me just not being used to this level of silence. I kept going. The trail climbed steeper now, switchbacking up the slope. My legs burned, and sweat dampened my shirt. I took short breaks, drinking from my bottle and checking the map. The printed map wasn't detailed, just a rough outline with trail names. It was enough to keep track of where I was, but I noticed the distances weren't very clear. I figured I still had plenty of time. Around midday, I stopped to eat a snack. I sat on a fallen log, listening to the woods. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. Off to my right, deeper in the trees, I thought I saw movement. At first, I assumed it was a deer, but when I looked closer, I didn't see anything, just the sway of branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved, something watching me. I told myself I was imagining it, that the woods play tricks when you're alone. I forced myself to keep walking. The trail wound higher until I finally reached the overlook. From there, I could see across the valley, a stretch of forested hills rolling off into the distance. It was beautiful, but I couldn't relax. The uneasy feeling from earlier clung to me. I ate quickly, then turned back. That's when the real trouble started. On the way down, I realized just how easy it was to lose the trail. In some places, it wasn't clear where the path went, just patches of dirt winding between brush. At one point, I followed what I thought was the trail, only to realize it narrowed and disappeared into undergrowth. I had to backtrack and find the right way. That mistake shook me more than it should have. I prided myself on not getting lost, but the woods were dense here, and everything looked the same. Tree after tree, ridge after ridge, the same greens and browns repeating. I started paying closer attention, looking for trail markers, making sure I didn't drift off again. But as I hiked, I felt that sensation again, the sense of being watched. At times I swore I heard footsteps behind me, just faint crunches of leaves. Every time I stopped to listen, the sound stopped too. I turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. My chest tightened. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer moving when I moved, freezing when I froze. But the thought lodged in my mind and wouldn't let go. The trail grew harder to follow the lower I got. The light had shifted. Shadows stretched longer, making everything blend together. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, I saw there was no signal. Just the time glowing back at me, later than I expected. I realized I had lingered longer than I meant to. Soon the trail forked again, and I hesitated. The map in my hand seemed less reliable now. I thought I remembered the way back, but both paths looked the same. I picked the one that felt right and started down it. For a while it seemed fine. Then I noticed it was dropping steeply, much more than I remembered. I stopped, pulled out the map, and frowned. It didn't show a steep descent here. My throat tightened. I turned around to go back, but now the fork itself looked different in my mind. I tried to picture how it had looked when I first came through, but the memory felt fuzzy. I stood there too long, second-guessing myself. That was the first real moment when fear began to push aside reason. I chose again, trying to trust my gut. But as the minutes passed, nothing looked familiar. The trail curved and narrowed, then split again in a way the map didn't show. I realized then that I wasn't just a little off course. I was lost. The words slammed into my chest like a weight. I tried not to panic. I told myself to stay calm, to retrace my steps. But when I turned, everything looked different. The woods closed in from all sides. The sun slipped lower, staining the light orange. I felt sweat break on my neck that had nothing to do with heat. I pushed myself to keep moving, to find something recognizable. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. At times I thought I heard water, a faint trickle, but when I followed it, the sound vanished. At other times I swore I saw shapes moving between trees, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. My nerves screamed. As the light faded, the woods grew darker fast. The shadows turned into solid walls. I pulled out my flashlight, clicked it on, and the narrow beam cut through the trees. It didn't help much. The light only made the darkness beyond feel thicker. Every noise jolted me. A branch snapping in the distance, the flutter of wings, the crunch of leaves. My mind turned every sound into footsteps. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it echoed in my ears. I kept moving, desperate to find the trail again, but the forest seemed endless. At one point, I stumbled on a patch of loose rocks and fell hard, skinning my palms. The pain grounded me, but it also made me realize how badly things could spiral. If I twisted an ankle out here, if I couldn't walk, no one would know where to find me. The other car at the trailhead earlier haunted me. Had they already left? Would anyone else even come this way tonight? I pushed myself back up, brushed dirt from my knees, and forced myself forward. Hours seemed to pass. The woods swallowed the last light, leaving only the weak glow of my flashlight. My water was nearly gone, and my stomach gnawed with hunger. My legs shook with exhaustion. Finally, I broke into a clearing, but instead of relief, dread washed over me. In the center of the clearing was an old, crumbling stone foundation, the remains of some building long gone. The place felt wrong. Not supernatural, just wrong because it meant I was far off any maintained trail. No map showed ruins here, confirmed how lost I really was. I crouched near the foundation, my back to the stones, trying to calm myself. The woods pressed in all around, the sounds of night animals rising. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone stepping from the trees or something lunging at me. I couldn't shake the fear. The night dragged on, each minute stretching. I knew I couldn't sleep. Not here, not like this. I had to keep moving, so I pushed myself back into the trees, flashlight beam swinging wildly. Branches clawed at my arms, roots grabbed at my feet. My body ached, but the thought of stopping filled me with even more fear. I don't know how long I wandered like that, stumbling and circling. I had been planning the hike for weeks. I wanted to do something different, something that would push me but also give me the quiet I had been craving. I had been working long hours, staring at screens all day, surrounded by people, noise, and traffic. My head felt crowded, and the only thing I could think about was being far away from all of it. I picked a trail that I had read about in a few online forums. It wasn't too well known, which was exactly what drew me to it. I didn't want a packed trail with families, joggers, and people blasting music from their phones. I wanted solitude, silence, and a challenge. The trail was in the mountains, a mix of steep climbs, narrow ridges, and long stretches of forest. The report said it wasn't easy, but if I managed to do the full loop, it would take a day and a half, maybe 2 days if I moved slower. I packed my gear carefully. I had my tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 2 days, a big water bottle, a filter straw, a knife, flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit, and a few energy bars tucked in my jacket pockets. I also carried a map printed from a hiking site and a compass, even though my phone had GPS. I didn't want to rely on just one thing. The morning I set out, the sky was overcast but calm. The air was cold and damp, the kind that makes the forest smell rich, almost earthy. The trailhead was empty when I parked. That gave me a small thrill. Felt like the whole place was mine. I tightened the straps of my backpack and started walking. At first, the hike was exactly what I wanted. The sound of my boots on dirt and leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. The path was narrow but clear, winding between trees and occasionally opening to views of valleys below. I moved at a steady pace, taking in the details I usually never notice in daily life. The way moss grew thick on fallen logs, the way tree roots twisted and curled across the ground like veins, the faint marks of deer hooves pressed into mud. By the time the sun was directly above, I was sweating. The trail had grown steeper, climbing toward the higher ridges. I stopped for water and a snack, leaning against a tree and catching my breath. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. I realized I hadn't seen anyone all day. No hikers, no distant voices, no dogs barking. Just me and the woods. I liked it that way. As afternoon slipped into evening, I reached a flat stretch of land that seemed perfect for camp. It was a clearing surrounded by tall pines, with soft ground and a fallen log that worked as a makeshift bench. I set up my tent, cooked a small meal on my camping stove, and ate slowly. The quiet was absolute. When the sun sank and the sky turned deep blue, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and lay still in my sleeping bag. That night was colder than I expected. I woke a few times shivering, pulling the sleeping bag tighter. Each time I woke, the silence pressed against my ears. No wind, no owls, nothing. Just pure, heavy stillness. It was so thick that even the sound of my breathing felt too loud. I told myself it was fine. It was the wilderness, not the city. Silence here was normal. The next morning, I packed quickly and started again. The trail climbed sharply, leading toward a narrow ridge. On one side was a drop into trees. On the other was a steep, rocky slope. I moved carefully, planting my feet with purpose. The higher I went, the more the wind picked up, whistling through cracks in the rocks and bending the branches of trees that clung to the ridge. My legs ached, but I kept pushing. Hours passed. I was deep in the loop now, far from where I had started, and I knew I wouldn't see my car again until tomorrow at the earliest. That was the plan. But then something began to bother me. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the rhythm was off. A faint crunch of leaves. Then again, always behind me, never ahead. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. My chest tightened. I slowly turned and looked down the trail. Nothing, just trees and brush. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a rabbit. The woods were full of animals. I started walking again. After a few minutes, there it was. Crunch, crunch, faint but clear. It matched my steps. I froze and held my breath. This time, the sound didn't stop right away. It carried on for another 2 or 3 steps. Then silence. My heart pounded. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting between trunks and shadows. Nothing moved. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was imagining it. I told myself to focus, keep walking. But as the hours went on, the feeling grew stronger. I wasn't alone. The trail dipped into a thick section of forest where the light barely touched the ground. The air smelled damp, heavy with rot. Every few steps, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I turned quickly more than once, convinced I'd see someone standing there. Each time there was nothing. By the time the sun began to fall, I was jumpy. My nerves were stretched tight. I found another clearing and set up camp, but my hands shook as I unpacked my tent. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the treeline. My ears strained at every sound. A twig snapping in the distance made me freeze. A rustle in the brush made me clutch my knife. I cooked quickly, barely tasting the food. When darkness fell, it was worse. I sat inside my tent with the flashlight off, listening. I couldn't hear footsteps anymore, but I couldn't relax. The silence seemed loaded now, like it was waiting. I lay down in my sleeping bag, but every time I closed my eyes, I snapped them open again. Hours passed. I barely slept. Sometime deep in the night, I heard it again. Crunch. Slow, deliberate, not far from my tent. My blood went cold. I didn't move. My breathing was shallow, almost silent. The footsteps circled, pausing, then moving again. At one point, I thought I heard the faintest sound of fabric brushing against fabric. My mouth went dry. Whoever it was, they were close. I gripped my knife inside the sleeping bag and lay still. The footsteps went on for what felt like forever, then finally drifted away. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, until the first light of dawn filtered through the thin walls of the tent. When I crawled out, the clearing looked the same as it had yesterday, except for one thing. About 20 feet from my tent, pressed into the soft dirt, was a footprint. A boot print, larger than mine. That was the moment I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone out there. Someone had followed me, watched me, walked around my tent in the middle of the night. Fear turned into urgency. I packed fast, skipping breakfast, and started down the trail. My plan to finish the loop was gone. I wanted out. I wanted back to my car, back to people, back to safety. I checked the map. There was a side trail that cut out of the loop and led back toward a forest road. It would take hours, but it was shorter than the full route. I headed that way. As I walked, I kept glancing behind me. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, a flash of color between trees, a shadow slipping out of sight. My mind screamed at me to move faster. I pushed my legs hard, ignoring the burn in my thighs, the ache in my shoulders. By afternoon, clouds gathered again, and the forest darkened. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Every noise made me flinch. Once, I was sure I heard breathing behind me. When I spun around, there was only the trees swaying in the wind. I finally reached the forest road just as the sky opened up with rain. My boots sank in mud as I hurried along the road, looking for any sign of people, a car, anything. The rain blurred everything, stinging my eyes, soaking my clothes. The road felt endless. And then, finally, around a bend, I saw it. My car, parked where I had left it 2 days before. Relief hit me so hard my knees went weak. I half ran, half stumbled to it, fumbling with the keys, throwing my pack inside, and locking the doors. Only then, sitting in the driver's seat with rain hammering the windshield, did I finally breathe. But as I pulled away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the trees where the trail met the road, was a figure, standing still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I pressed the gas until the forest was far behind me. I never went back to that trail again, and I never forgot the sound of footsteps in the dark. I had been planning the hike for weeks. It was the kind of trip I wanted to do alone. Something that felt challenging but also quiet, far away from city noise, far away from people. I wanted to spend time in the woods without hearing car engines or seeing anyone else. I chose a section of trail that was known for being remote, not a popular tourist hike, but not completely abandoned either. The maps showed long stretches of thick forest, narrow ridges, and deep valleys where no roads cut through. The route I picked was supposed to take me 3 days to complete if I moved at a steady pace. I packed enough food, water filters, and gear for 5 days just in case something slowed me down. When I started out, the morning was cool. The sky was gray but not stormy. The air felt damp, and I could smell the wet ground. My backpack was heavy, pressing against my shoulders, but I was used to it from other hikes. The first few miles were simple. The trail was wide and clear, with orange markers nailed to trees every few hundred feet. The ground was damp but not muddy, just soft under my boots. My breathing was steady, and I moved at a pace that felt easy enough to keep for hours. I liked the quiet. By midday, I was deeper into the forest. The sound of traffic was gone. All I could hear was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird high above me. The trees were tall, blocking most of the sunlight, so the trail had a dim look even though it was still the middle of the day. My GPS tracker beeped now and then as it marked my progress, but I didn't pull it out much. I preferred to check my paper map and compass when I stopped for water. The first day felt normal. I walked about 10 miles before setting up camp near a creek. The water was cold and clear, and I filtered enough to fill both bottles. My small stove worked without any trouble, and I ate a warm meal before rolling out my sleeping bag. The air grew colder quickly as the sun dropped. The woods were silent, darker than I liked, but I told myself it was fine. I had camped alone before. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I would wake again at the sound of something small moving through the leaves. A rabbit or raccoon, I guessed, but in the dark, every sound felt bigger than it was. I kept my knife close, even though I knew it wasn't much protection. Around 2 in the morning, I finally drifted into a deeper sleep, but I woke up stiff and tired when the sun rose. On the second day, the trail became harder. The path grew narrow, with roots twisting up through the dirt. My boots slipped a few times where the ground tilted steeply down into the valley. I had to use my hands on rocks in a few places to steady myself. By noon, the air had grown hotter. The sky cleared, and I was sweating heavily under the straps of my pack. I kept drinking water and moving forward, though my legs felt heavier than the day before. The woods felt thicker here. The trail markers were spread farther apart, and I had to look carefully to spot them. I noticed how quiet everything seemed. I didn't hear many birds anymore. The trees blocked the wind, so even the leaves hardly moved. It was the kind of silence that made me too aware of my own breathing. In the late afternoon, I came to a section of trail that looked washed out. The dirt had slid down the slope, and what remained was loose rock and mud. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, debating whether to cross or try to find another way. The map showed no alternate trail. I stepped carefully, pressing my boots into the mud, testing each step before putting my weight on it. Halfway across, my left boot slipped. I threw my weight down, catching myself with my hand on a rock. My heart pounded as dirt slid away beneath me. I kept still until it settled, then slowly pushed forward until I was back on firm ground. My palms were scraped, and my legs shook with adrenaline. I kept going until dusk and camped on flatter ground this time, a small clearing just off the trail. I felt tired, more than I should have after 2 days. My knees ached, and my back hurt from the pack. I cooked dinner slowly, chewing without much hunger. When the sun went down, I lay awake again, listening. The forest noises seemed closer tonight. I could hear branches snapping, heavy steps, not just the rustle of small animals. I told myself it was deer. They moved through the woods at night often. Still, I kept my knife within reach and I barely slept. The third day was worse. My legs felt weak as I started out. I tried to ignore it and kept moving, but the trail grew steeper. By late morning, I had to stop every half hour to catch my breath. My water supply was low, and the streams I found were small, clogged with leaves and mud. I filtered what I could, but it tasted like dirt. The forest looked darker today, even though the sky above was clear. The trail markers were harder to find. Twice I thought I had lost the path completely, but after backtracking, I managed to spot faint signs of the orange paint on trees. The silence pressed down on me. I noticed then that I hadn't seen any sign of people since I started. No footprints in the mud, no broken branches from other hikers. I felt cut off as if the trail was abandoned. In the afternoon, I came to a ridge. The view stretched out for miles. Rolling green hills, valleys, and endless forest. It should have been beautiful, but the height made me nervous. The trail followed the ridge, narrow with drops on both sides. I forced myself forward, staring at my boots, not the drop. By the time I stopped that night, I was shaking with exhaustion. My food supply looked smaller than I expected. I had packed plenty, but I had eaten more often than I thought, maybe from nerves or tiredness. I counted carefully, realizing I had just enough for 2 more days. That meant I couldn't afford to slow down. That night, I barely slept again. I heard noises in the woods, louder than before. Heavy steps like someone moving slowly through the trees. My chest tightened as I lay there, staring into the dark. I tried to breathe quietly, listening. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I waited, not moving, until finally, after what felt like an hour, I heard them fade away. My body stayed tense the rest of the night. The 4th morning, I woke with burning eyes, my body sore all over. I packed quickly and pushed forward. The trail wound down into a valley, and the air grew damp and heavy. I felt dizzy as I walked, stumbling more than once. I forced myself to eat a small snack to keep my energy up. My map showed that I was still halfway from the nearest road. By midday, I was struggling badly. My water bottle was nearly empty. I followed the trail down, hoping to find another creek. The woods felt tighter here, the trees closer together. Every sound made me flinch. I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, I saw nothing. The silence returned, heavier than before. Late in the afternoon, I finally found water. A small stream cut through the valley. I dropped to my knees, filling both bottles, drinking deeply before filtering more. The relief was short. My body still felt drained, and my legs shook as I stood again. I kept going until dusk, but I could barely move by then. I chose a flat spot near the stream to camp. My hands trembled as I lit my stove. I forced food down, though it tasted like nothing. I lay in my bag trying to rest. That night, I woke to the sound of movement again. This time, it was closer, circling my camp. My heart pounded. I stayed completely still, listening to the slow crunch of leaves moving around me. Then silence. I waited, holding my breath. When I finally dozed again, I dreamed of being followed, of shadows moving behind the trees. By the 5th day, I was at my limit. My body ached everywhere. My water and food were running out. The trail markers grew even harder to find. I lost the path twice, wasting hours backtracking. My head spun with every step. I kept thinking about the footsteps I had heard, the feeling of being watched. By midday, my knees gave out, and I stumbled hard onto the dirt. I lay there, chest heaving, sweat pouring down my face. I forced myself up, leaning on my trekking pole, dragging one foot in front of the other. My vision blurred at times. The map said I was close to the road, maybe 4 miles. 4 miles felt impossible. I kept moving, though. My only thought was to get out. When I finally saw the break in the trees, the sight of pavement nearly made me collapse. I staggered out of the woods, boots hitting the road. My whole body shook with relief. I dropped my pack on the gravel shoulder and sank down, too weak to stand. I sat there for nearly an hour, breathing hard, staring at the empty road. No cars passed. I felt a deep, heavy exhaustion sink into me, but the fear finally eased. I was out. The woods were behind me. I had made it. The hike had drained everything from me. My strength, my nerves, my confidence. The noises I heard at night, the footsteps circling my camp. I never knew if they were real or just my mind twisting from lack of... I had been planning the hike for weeks, marking trails on maps, checking weather forecasts, making sure I had the right gear. I wanted something challenging but not impossible. Something that would push me far out but still let me make it back safely. The place I picked was a canyon system a few hours from where I lived. A place that didn't get as many tourists as the bigger national parks. It was wild country, long stretches of sandstone cliffs, narrow slot canyons, dried riverbeds that only carried water when the rains came hard. I set out early in the morning. My backpack was heavy but balanced, filled with water, food, a first aid kit, a headlamp, spare batteries, extra clothes, a knife, and a paper map with the trail drawn on it. I also had a compass and a GPS unit, though I had been told the signal sometimes cut out inside the canyon walls. My boots were broken in, and I had layers packed for the shifting desert temperatures. The trail started wide and easy, a dirt path leading down toward the canyon floor. At that hour, the sun was still low, the air cool, and the silence deep. Only the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird broke the stillness. The canyon walls on either side rose higher the farther I went, the path narrowing, the sky becoming just a strip of pale blue above me. After about an hour, the trail forked. One path was marked as the main loop, a safer, more used trail. The other was smaller, rougher, marked with only a wooden post leaning sideways. According to my map, this side trail cut deeper into the canyon before joining back to the loop much farther ahead. That was the one I wanted. I wanted to see the less traveled places, the quiet places. I told myself I was ready for the solitude. The walls closed in tighter as I moved on. At times I had to squeeze through narrow gaps where the rock pressed close. My pack scraped against stone. The light dimmed in those passages, and the air cooled. When the slot would open again, sunlight poured down in bright shafts that made the sand glow red and gold. I stopped often to take in the shapes carved by centuries of water, curves like waves frozen in stone, patterns like rippling cloth. After several hours, I stopped to rest in a shaded alcove, drinking water and eating a snack. The silence was heavy. I realized I had not seen a single other hiker since leaving the main trail. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I pushed it aside. This was what I had wanted. The raw, untouched quiet. I continued deeper. The trail was less clear now. Sometimes it vanished into smooth stone and I had to look for cairns. Small stacks of rocks left by other hikers to mark the way. A few of them looked old, toppled, or scattered, and I had to trust my map and compass. By mid-afternoon, the air grew hotter. The walls reflected the sun down into the canyon, making the heat press like an oven. I sweated hard and rationed my water carefully. The path wound upward then down again, twisting through dry stream beds. I noticed the tracks of animals in the sand, deer maybe or coyotes. A few looked large, too large for a coyote. I moved on faster, reminding myself that animals usually avoided people. The narrow canyon eventually opened into a wide basin. Here the rock walls fell back, leaving a flat stretch of desert floor with scrub bushes and scattered boulders. It was beautiful but unsettling. The space was too open after hours of confinement. The wind blew across it, carrying grit that stung my skin. I crossed the basin carefully, following faint trail markers toward where the canyon walls closed again on the far side. It was when I was halfway across that I realized how alone I was. No sound of people, No sight of footprints newer than my own. Just endless space. The realization made the hair on my arms stand up. I kept going, telling myself to focus. The trail led back into the stone. This part was darker, narrower, twisting. My GPS lost signal. I checked the map often, but the canyon walls looked so similar it was hard to match the lines on paper to the stone around me. I felt a knot in my stomach that grew each time I wasn't certain I was on the right way. Hours passed. I kept moving, slower now, more careful. At one point, I slipped on loose gravel and scraped my arm. Blood ran down to my wrist before I wrapped it with gauze from my kit. The sting of it, the sight of the blood, shook me more than it should have. It reminded me that mistakes out here were not small. By the time I reached a narrow bend with steep walls and a dry pool at the bottom, the sun had dropped lower. The light was fading. I checked my map again and realized I was behind schedule. The trail was supposed to loop back toward the main route, but I hadn't seen the junction yet. I pushed on, thinking I would find it before dark. But the canyon grew even tighter, the walls leaning above me like a closing grip. The floor was uneven, broken by boulders that forced me to climb or squeeze past. My legs trembled with fatigue. My throat was dry even though I drank carefully from my bottles. Then I came to a point where the trail seemed to vanish completely. The canyon split in two directions. One branch was narrow, shadowed, filled with tumbled rock. The other was wider, smoother, but steep. I pulled out my map, studied it, turned it, but the lines were vague. I wasn't sure which way was right. The sun slipped behind the canyon rim, and shadows poured down like water filling the space. I turned on my headlamp, its narrow beam cutting only a small circle of light. The world outside that circle vanished into darkness. I chose the wider branch, thinking it might be the main path. I climbed, breath heavy, hands scraping on stone. The light bobbed and shook, and I realized how easy it would be to drop the lamp, how terrible it would be to lose that beam. The climb ended in a dead end, a sheer wall too high to scale. My chest tightened. I turned back, the circle of light trembling across stone. Every shadow seemed to move as I passed. I went into the narrower branch, crawling over boulders, my pack catching, my knees bruising on stone. The walls pressed so close I had to squeeze sideways in places. My breathing echoed loud, too loud. After what felt like hours, the canyon opened slightly, enough for me to sit. I was exhausted. My legs ached. My arms burned. My throat felt like sand. I drank the last of one water bottle, saving the other half-filled one for later. My food was running low. My map made less sense the more I looked at it. I realized then that I was lost. Completely. The loop I thought I had been following was gone. The landmarks didn't match. My GPS still had no signal. The weight of it sank in like cold water. I thought about turning back, retracing every step, but the maze of branches I had taken made that seem impossible. I could barely remember which turn had led where. The rock all looked the same, so I pushed on, deeper, hoping to find an opening, a way back to the main trail. Night deepened. The headlamp beam caught only stone, sand, the occasional gleam of animal eyes that vanished when I moved closer. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the scuff of my boots and the pounding of my heart. I found a ledge above the canyon floor and climbed up to it. It was barely wide enough to sit on. I decided I had to rest there for the night. My body shook with exhaustion. I pulled my jacket tighter against the cold. The wind moaned faintly through the canyon, carrying sand that rattled against the stone. I sat there in the dark, staring into the blackness, unable to sleep. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow deeper. At one point, I thought I heard movement on the canyon floor below. Slow, deliberate. My lamp beam swept down, but nothing was there. My heart thudded painfully until I convinced myself it was just loose rock shifting in the cooling air. Hours passed like that, endless and slow. My thoughts circled between fear and hope, between plans to climb out and the dread that I couldn't. When dawn finally lit the canyon with pale light, I climbed down, stiff and sore. I started walking again, forcing one step after another. By mid-morning, I found something that froze me in place, a boot print in the sand. fresh, not mine, pointed down the canyon. I followed it, quickening my pace despite my fatigue. More prints appeared, spaced irregularly, as if whoever left them had been moving unevenly. After an hour, the prints led me into a wider canyon where the walls fell back slightly, and there, collapsed near a rock, was a backpack. Torn, weathered, partly buried in sand. I went to it, heart pounding. It was old, sun-bleached, straps frayed. I opened it carefully. Inside were cracked water bottles, rusted cans, scraps of paper too faded to read. It looked like it had been there for years. But then where had the fresh boot prints come from? I felt a surge of panic. I turned in circles, scanning the sand. The prints were still there, but now they were mixed with scuffs, as if someone had stood in place, turning before walking off again. The trail led farther down the canyon. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to